this question of ethics from a really simple standpoint, the framework that I like to take on is that of just non-harm. Mm-hmm. And I like it because of its simplicity. And when I'm talking about ethics, from the way I view it, I'm not talking about it from a moralistic standpoint. I'm not talking about that this is good or this is bad, right or wrong. All of those adjectives feel like evaluations. And from a mindfulness perspective, it's not really about taking positions. It's actually about letting go of positions. From a mindfulness perspective, we're cultivating awareness to have clarity. And in a sense, that the purity and the sincerity of that intention, I feel, is enough. Because if I can see clearly what my impact is, naturally, I would choose non-harm. And the reason for that is everything leaves a residue. Every thought that we have leads to a physical residue and an emotional residue, which oftentimes informs the next moment, which leads to a tone for that next moment or more proliferations that are extensions of what originally started. And so the ethics is to be able to have clarity about how I am being, because how I am being is going to color all of the thoughts and actions that come forth from that point.
Okay.
And so if I'm thinking skillful thoughts, that's going to lead to skillful actions, which are going to lead to a ripple out effect of other skillful consequences. Right? If I'm having unskillful thoughts, that's going to lead to unskillful actions, which is going to create a whole residue that goes out into the world that is unskillful. So again, I'm trying to be very careful about the words that I'm using because I'm trying to pull out what might have a value attached to it. So I'm not saying good or bad. And what I mean by skillful is that that thought or that action is going to contribute towards my clarity, my access to awareness, and to my well-being. And unskillful thoughts or actions are going to interfere with my clarity, my access to awareness, and my ability to experience well-being. Right? So just keeping it very, very simple. And so how do we go about having the ethics of non-harm? Well, that too, I think, is really simple. We observe. We observe our thoughts. And we see what the impact of those thoughts are on our actions and on ourselves and on other people. And from watching the impact, we ask the question, does this bring more connection? Does this bring about more well-being? And if it doesn't, then that means I'm misaligned.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I'm bad, not that I'm incompetent, not that this is wrong. I'm just misaligned with what my intentions are, which is of wanting more presence, more connection, more mindfulness in my life. And one of the places that I've wanted to start tracking impact is on self. So before even tracking what's my impact on other people, what are the impacts of the choices that I make for myself? And what are the consequences for that? So again, on a very simplistic level, I can start with the body. What kind of choices do I make for my body? And what's the impact? What does the body need in order for clarity? It needs a rested nervous system. It needs nourishment. It needs time and space to digest the information that it's receiving. It needs to feel safe. Do I offer enough sleep to my body? Do I offer nutritious foods? Do I have a day where there is enough space to be able to allow the nervous system to unwind on its own? What about the mind? What's the impact of the choices on my mind? What do I expose my mind to? My mind learns very quickly. Do I offer it wholesome activities or medium? Do I offer it the opportunity to learn and to grow? Or do I distract it? Or do I give it information that leads to a propagation of thoughts that cause harm? This could be as simple as choosing what kind of movie I'm going to watch. Do I offer it violence? Or do I offer it a perspective that it hadn't considered before? In terms of the heart, who's allowed to be with me in my vulnerability? Is this person safe? How do I relate to my own self? Do I listen to the inner critic? Or instead, can I be with the difficulty or the pain when I've made a mistake? So these are just some different examples of how we can be with the ethics of non-harm. And again, if you notice from the examples that I'm making, a lot of it is not necessarily starting with action, which is where we like to go. A lot of it is starting by just listening and observing. We can come at this at a behavioral standpoint. I can come up with rules for myself of what I'm allowed to eat, what I'm not allowed to eat, when I go to sleep. And I have to be very careful with that. Because if the sentiment that is propelling these kinds of actions are coming from forcefulness and control and trying to make it better, they're not going to work out. But if instead I can bring more awareness to how I feel after I eat a pint of ice cream and allow myself to notice what it's like to go beyond threshold of what is pleasure. Because while it might have started off as something delightful, if I didn't pay attention to what I was doing and I unconsciously followed the compulsion to finish, I'm left with a residue. And that residue is a physical not well-being. And there's an emotional residue also. A story will come into being of whatever, that leads to unpleasant emotions of guilt or shame or whatever else. And so it's important to notice what's propelling us into action. Are we in a state of presence and connection when we're making these decisions? Or are these decisions compulsive actions that are happening that we're not completely conscious of until after the fact? Or maybe we are very conscious of it, but there is the tone of forcefulness or making something happen. Ethics in itself, or wanting to approach things with a particular type of ethics, is mindfulness. Because we're tracking intention and we're tracking the result of. And based on what we learn from that, we can make corrections. Ultimately, what we're doing is we're building a more intentional life where we are actively engaged in facilitating us developing more well-being. And as a result of that, you have more clarity, which leads to more awareness. And it's just this positive feedback that we are in. And so the key is to stay aware. And it's not a linear thing. It's not that I'm going to cultivate awareness so that I can have better physical, emotional, and mental well-being. They kind of go together. The physical, emotional, and mental well-being will lead to the clarity that I need. And so that it's just this feedback loop that happens. And so we can start with ourselves. And what's really interesting is that when we are self-connected and when we have met our basic needs for safety, for health, for emotional well-being, we actually, at least I can only speak for myself, that the natural disposition is that I feel so complete and so nourished that I actually am interested in something outside of myself. And I move into this place of wanting to serve. And so the interactions that I start having with other people has a very different tone because I'm not wanting anything out of the interaction with the other person. I'm coming to it without an agenda. I'm coming to it without the rigidity of it needing to be a particular way. And what that does for the other is it offers a sense of safety because there's no pressure in the interaction. And when the other has a sense of safety, something beautiful happens. And that what that is that they come alive, they come into presence. And the quality of the interaction that results from that is this beautiful sense of connection and intimacy. That I can let go of them needing to be a particular way to meet whatever needs that I think that I have, because I've met that for myself. And so that what we're doing instead of defending our hearts or trying to contrive a situation, we are instead coming forward with the wholeness of ourselves, and we are co-creating a moment together. It's a very different way of being able to interact and be together. And by me having access to myself, what it does, in a sense, is it stabilizes the other's nervous system so that they can have access to themselves. And when we are in this place of presence, the residue of that is carried even as we separate and go into our own ways. And so the ethics that I have for myself and how I want to lead my life, whether it's in my personal relationship with myself or the relationship to others, ends up affecting the collective. When we're coming from the framework of helping, there's an automatic inequity that is assumed from the beginning, which is that me as the helper, I have a capacity that you that needs to be helped doesn't have, and I'm going to offer that to you. Mm-hmm. And this is great, the mention of intention and impact, because the intention might be that of really wanting to do something of benefit. But the impact of helping another might not have the intended impact that we had thought of when we started off. And one of the things that often happens with helping is that we are exerting our way on top of somebody else's finding their way, because in that moment, they don't know what that way is. Serving, the way they expressed it, I really liked it, was meeting the other with empathy. So that we are just being with presence and support. And what the empathy does is it soothes the other. And when they feel seen and heard and not so alone, when they've met their need for being understood, they actually have a larger capacity. And that gives them access for finding the solution themselves. Mm-hmm. And there's something incredibly empowering when we take ownership for finding our own way through the challenges that we have. And so I like this example when looking at the ethics of non-harm, because there are some places where it can be really tricky, right? And helping is one of those areas where the original intention might be of wanting to do something for the other person so that they feel better. But if I were to bring mindfulness really into it, what else is happening in that moment? Well, what's happening is my discomfort about the other person not feeling great. What's happening in the moment is maybe a sense of helplessness. Mm-hmm. What's happening in the moment is my fix-it conditioning is jumping in to do something because I don't like the experience that I'm having in that moment. Mm-hmm. And what I'm doing is a transgression over the other person, because I am inserting my will over another and robbing them of the ability to actually be with their own experience so that they can get all of the information that they need to make the most appropriate response for themselves. So the deeper we start going into the mindfulness and really take the time to observe what's happening, the more interesting these ethics become. Because we're in this constant balance of either being with what's going on and observing and listening and taking it in, or jumping into action. Ultimately, the question starts to become to be or to do. When do I know which of those two I should be doing? Holding back and waiting, or moving forward and acting? Mm. And the guiding question that I always use for myself is, what's sponsoring this moment? Is what's sponsoring this moment a state of conditioning, meaning I'm only semi-conscious and I'm activated myself and there is a compulsion to do something. And that compulsion has a flavor. There's like a psychological felt sense to that compulsion. If I'm able to see that, then I know I need to step back and wait. If there is clarity, if there is presence, I can take a small step forward to see how that lands to the other person and wait to see what the response is, to be informed of what the next step is. So what I'm doing is I'm attuning, I'm taking a very small action without going all the way to completion, without running over with what I want to do for the other person. And I'm seeing, does that lead to well-being for the other person? Does that give them more access to that, to themselves? Am I able to stay connected with that small action? And that will inform me of what the next step is, which is to withhold or to take another step forward. And being able to see this, and even better, being able to communicate it to the other person so that there is consent about whether that action is welcomed or not, is what's going to help me to navigate this with the ethics of non-harm. And so again, I'm not coming up with a list of behaviors of how to live by. What I'm doing is I'm finessing the acuity of my observation powers. And being able to see clearly is enough to allow me to navigate this life with the ethics of non-harm. So maybe another way of thinking of the ethics of non-harm is of non-interference.
Okay.
So that we're allowing things to happen without having the compulsion to interfere and change them.
Yes.
Even if we know of a more skillful way for the other.
Yes.
This is very challenging.
Yes.
In particular, if you're watching someone you love suffer.
Yes.
And you know how you could alleviate that.
No.
And there is this compulsion to tell them. Another way of reframing the non-harm is don't interfere. And so what do we do instead if we're feeling uncomfortable and worried about the other person? Well, we meet them with empathy, because what a person most wants when they're going through difficulty is to be understood and to be accompanied. This gives them access to seeing for themselves. Or this gives them the safety to trust their vulnerability with you, where they might actually want to know what your perspective is. And if they ask for your perspective, that's the appropriate time to share the perspective. Right? So that it's full consent without me pushing an agenda or manipulating my view somewhere in there. This is very tricky again, because it takes a high degree of stability and presence and the ability to withhold the compulsion to act out. What happens when there is a transgression? What happens when we cause harm? Well, the good news is that we can do do-overs. So if we cause harm and we realize it, we take responsibility for it. And we tell the other, if there is another that's involved, or it could be even to the self. If you realize you did a transgression with yourself, you pushed yourself to do something that you weren't comfortable with, or the inner critic came out full force when you were feeling vulnerable after making a mistake, you have a do-over. And that do-over has the effect that allows for the residue to change. there's something about taking responsibility
Mhm.
that absolves, in a sense, some of the impact.
Mhm.
What it also does is it fosters trust,
Mm.
because if I can take responsibility for a transgression that I made, it means that I deeply care about what my impact is, and that I'm deeply committed to acting with the ethics of non-harm. And maybe one of the practices for this week would be to notice when there is harm that's created, not in a judgy kind of way,
Mhm.
but any kind of nuance of harm. It could be the most obvious one.
Yeah.
And then notice what the residue is of that.
Yeah.
And let yourself be in the residue of that, because what we're doing is we are calibrating our biofeedback mechanism that we can use as a compass to navigate when we're not sure. So the residue will always let you know, were you on the mark or are you off the mark?
Right.
So this week, go and explore life and just see if you can notice, ooh, that was outside of alignment
No.
with non-harm. And let yourself feel the residue. If there's an opportunity for do-over, try it out. It's
Yeah.
really beautiful. It's sometimes even more connecting to make the mistake than to not make the mistake, if we can go and repair that. And then also notice when you're in alignment, what's the biofeedback for being in alignment and maybe withholding from following a compulsion that might lead to harm.